His parents ran into a burning building to save children and never came back. They left behind nothing except a 6-month-old baby who would grow up homeless, alone, and with only $20 to his name. 19 years later, he unknowingly bought the same abandoned library connected to their final days. But hidden behind a sealed wall was a secret buried for nearly 20 years. Before this story is over, powerful developers will panic. A forgotten key will unlock the truth, and one young man's courage will expose a corruption scheme worth millions. So stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. A cool late autumn morning settled over Birmingham, Alabama. Gray clouds covered the sky, and a chilly breeze carried the smell of damp leaves, old brick, and rain that had not yet fallen. 19-year-old Elijah Brooks had learned that the world did not usually stop for boys like him. It kept moving, even when they had nowhere to sleep, nothing warm to eat, and nobody waiting to hear whether they made it through another day. 3 weeks earlier, he had walked out of the foster care office with a backpack, a plastic folder of documents, and $58.17 on a prepaid card. The woman behind the desk had told him he was officially an adult now. Elijah had nodded because nodding was easier than asking what kind of adult had no home, no family, no job, and no one to call. Elijah was tall for his age, just over 6 feet, with a lean frame shaped more by hunger than strength. His skin was a deep brown, smooth but tired-looking under the harsh lights of bus stations and convenience stores. His hair was cropped close, uneven in places from trimming it himself with borrowed clippers. His eyes were a warm hazel brown, quiet and watchful, the kind of eyes that had learned to read danger before words were spoken. He wore the same faded gray hoodie almost every day, dark jeans with a worn knee, and sneakers that had begun to split at the sides. He did not look weak. He looked like someone who had been forced to become careful too early. For 3 weeks, Birmingham had given him sidewalks, benches, and polite rejections. He slept twice behind a church, once in a bus station until a security guard told him to move along, and several nights beneath an old oak tree in a small park where the branches blocked the wind. During the day, he filled out applications at grocery stores, warehouses, diners, and auto shops. Some managers looked at him and saw a young man trying. Others saw a problem they did not want near their business. Either way, the answer was almost always the same: "We'll give you a call." No one ever did. By the 4th Thursday, Elijah had $31 left and a hunger that made his hands tremble when he went too long without eating. He was walking past the Jefferson County Courthouse, not heading anywhere in particular, when he noticed folding chairs arranged on the lawn and a small crowd gathered near the steps. A county auction was underway. Most of the people there looked like they belonged to a different version of America than the one Elijah knew. They wore clean jackets, leather shoes, and expressions of casual confidence. They shook hands, laughed softly, and talked about properties as if buildings were cards in a game. Elijah stayed near the back, partly because the courthouse wall blocked the wind. A county clerk stood behind a wooden podium with a microphone. Her name tag read Linda Harris. She was a white woman in her early 50s with shoulder-length chestnut hair streaked with gray and kind blue eyes behind thin glasses. Her voice was firm but not cold, the voice of someone who had spent years delivering facts to people who did not always like hearing them. The properties came and went quickly. A vacant lot sold for $900. An old repair garage went for $3,000. A foreclosed duplex drew several bidders and ended at more money than Elijah had ever held in his life. He was about to walk away when Linda lifted the final sheet of paper. "Last property on today's list," she said. "Former Westwood Community Library, closed since 2017. Significant water damage, broken windows, partial roof failure. Property subject to future redevelopment review. Opening bid is $20. A faded photo of the building was clipped to the front of the file. Elijah saw cracked brick walls, boarded windows, weeds growing waist-high around the entrance, and an old sign with missing letters. It looked forgotten. Not empty exactly. Forgotten. No one raised a hand. A man in the second row laughed. He was heavyset, with a red face, a trimmed gray mustache, and a tan sport coat stretched tight across his shoulders. "You'd spend $20 just to get tetanus walking inside," he said. A few people chuckled. Another bidder shook his head. "County should pay somebody to take it." Elijah stared at the photo longer than he meant to. He did not know why the building pulled at him. Maybe because nobody wanted it. Maybe because it had been left behind and then blamed for falling apart. Maybe because, for the first time in weeks, he saw something that looked worse off than he was and still standing. His hand rose before his common sense could stop it. "I'll bid 20. The laughter turned toward him. Linda paused. $20 from the young man in the back. Do I hear 25? Silence. A woman whispered, poor boy doesn't know what he's doing. Elijah heard her clearly. He kept his hand down now, but his jaw tightened. Going once, Linda said. Going twice. The gavel struck. Sold. Inside the courthouse, Elijah signed 3 papers and watched $20 disappear from the little money he had left. Linda looked at him across the counter with something between concern and respect. You understand this building has no utilities, she said gently. No water, no electricity. The roof is damaged. The county has not maintained it for years. I understand. Do you have someone helping you? Elijah almost smiled. No, Mom. Linda studied him for a moment. Then be careful in there. Old buildings remember things, but they also hide things. She slid a brass key across the counter. Elijah took it. The metal felt cold in his palm. The Westwood Community Library stood 6 blocks from the courthouse, on the edge of a quiet neighborhood where small homes sat behind chain-link fences and bare trees leaned over cracked sidewalks. The building was larger than it had looked in the photograph. 2 stories of red brick. Tall front windows, a wide entrance framed by stone columns darkened from years of rain. The sign above the door read Westwood Community Libra with the final letters missing. Inside, the air smelled of dust, damp wood, and old paper. Sunlight came through broken windows in thin gray strips. Shelves leaned at odd angles. Ceiling tiles had fallen across the reading room floor. Children's books lay scattered near a faded mural of smiling animals. Elijah stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the silence. For the first time since leaving foster care, no one told him to move. That night, he slept behind the circulation desk with his backpack under his head and his hoodie pulled tight around his body. The floor was hard, and cold air slipped through the broken windows, but there was a roof above him. A damaged roof, but still a roof. Elijah closed his eyes and tried not to think about the people who had laughed at him. Maybe they were right. Maybe he had just bought a problem. But the thought that followed was stubborn and strange. It was his problem now. Over the next 3 weeks, Elijah worked on the library from sunrise until his body gave out. He swept glass from the reading room, stacked fallen books by subject when their covers were still readable, dragged ruined furniture into one corner, and used plastic sheets from a discount store to cover the worst of the broken windows. A black man in his late 60s named Mr. Calvin Reed, who owned a small hardware store 2 blocks away, noticed him carrying boards one afternoon. Calvin was broad-shouldered with dark brown skin, a square jaw, a white beard trimmed close, and large hands scarred from decades of carpentry work. He spoke slowly, not because he was unsure, but because he believed words should be worth the breath it took to say them. You the boy who bought the library? Calvin asked. Yes, sir. Calvin looked at the boards, then at Elijah's tired face. You got a hammer? No, sir. Calvin sighed, as if disappointed in the whole world. Come by my shop. He lent Elijah a hammer, a pry bar, a box of nails, and later, without making a show of it, handed him a paper bag with 2 biscuits and a bottle of water. Elijah thanked him, but Calvin only waved him off. Don't thank me. Just don't drop that roof on your head. Calvin did not ask too many questions, and Elijah appreciated that. Most people wanted a sad story before they offered help. Calvin seemed to understand that some wounds did not need to be opened just because someone was curious. By the end of the 3rd week, Elijah had cleared most of the main floor. He began working in the basement, where old filing cabinets, broken chairs, and shelves of outdated magazines had been left to rot. The basement was colder than the rest of the building. Its concrete walls sweated moisture, and every sound echoed too loudly. Near the back, behind a row of heavy steel file cabinets, Elijah noticed something odd. The wall behind them did not match the others. Most of the basement was old brick, but this section was smooth gray concrete block, newer than the rest, sealed roughly at the edges. The cabinets were not simply sitting in front of it. They were bolted into the floor and into one another, forming a steel barrier. Elijah knelt and shined his small flashlight along the bottom edge. A thin crack ran beneath the wall, no wider than a pencil. From that crack came a steady stream of cold air. He froze. There was space behind it. The next morning, Elijah went to Calvin's hardware store and asked if he knew anything about the basement wall. Calvin stood behind the counter, his face changing the moment Elijah described it. He removed his reading glasses and looked toward the library through the front window. That wall wasn't there when the library was built, Calvin said. Elijah waited. Calvin's voice dropped. And whoever put it there didn't want folks asking why. That night, Elijah sat alone in the basement with the flashlight beside him and the steel cabinets rising in front of him like a locked gate. Above him, the old library groaned softly in the wind. He thought about Linda's warning. about old buildings hiding things. He thought about Calvin's face when he mentioned the wall. Then he looked at his blistered hands, his only tools, his only proof that he had not given up. Tomorrow morning, he would borrow a socket wrench and take those cabinets apart, and whatever waited behind that wall, Elijah Brooks was going to find it. The following morning, Elijah barely slept. Every creak of the old library seemed louder than the last, as if the building itself knew what he intended to do. Before sunrise, he walked the 2 blocks to Calvin Reed's hardware store, where the lights were already glowing behind the front window. Calvin unlocked the door before Elijah could knock. "I figured you'd be here early," the older man said. He handed Elijah a heavy socket wrench set without asking for payment. Then he reached beneath the counter and placed a thermos of coffee beside it. "You've got the look," Calvin said. "The same look folks get before opening something that probably ought to stay closed." Elijah managed a tired smile. "I have to know." Calvin nodded once. "Then don't rush. Old buildings punish impatient people." An hour later, Elijah knelt beside the first steel cabinet in the basement. Rust coated every bolt. His hands ached before the first one finally broke loose with a loud crack that echoed through the empty library. The second cabinet took 20 minutes. The third nearly an hour. Sweat rolled down his forehead despite the cold basement air. Every muscle in his shoulders burned as he dragged each cabinet aside across the concrete floor. Metal scraped loudly enough to send pigeons fluttering from the broken windows upstairs. By early afternoon, the final cabinet stood against the opposite wall. For the first time, the concrete partition was fully visible. There was a steel door built directly into it. No sign, no handle, only a heavy deadbolt that had rusted almost beyond recognition. Elijah stared at it for several long seconds. Someone had not simply hidden a room. Someone had wanted it forgotten. He wedged Calvin's pry bar between the frame and the lock, throwing his weight against it again and again until, with a sharp metallic snap, the bolt finally gave way. The door groaned inward. A rush of cold, stale air drifted into the basement. It smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and dust that had not been disturbed in decades. Elijah switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The room looked strangely untouched. A solid oak desk stood in the center beneath a brass reading lamp. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Shelves filled with carefully labeled binders covered another. Dust rested evenly across every surface, proof that no one had entered since the room had been sealed. Nothing appeared vandalized. Nothing appeared stolen. It felt less like discovering a forgotten room than interrupting someone who had stepped away only moments before. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal. Beside it rested a framed photograph of an elderly woman smiling gently toward the camera. She wore a navy cardigan over a cream blouse. Her silver hair was cut neatly to her shoulders, framing a warm face marked by fine lines, earned through years of smiling more than frowning. Her eyes carried the calm confidence of someone who believed knowledge mattered more than recognition. The brass nameplate beneath the photograph read, Margaret Ellis Library Director. Elijah lowered himself into the old wooden chair. He opened the journal carefully. The first pages contained ordinary entries, book donations, roof repairs, children's reading events, volunteer schedules. Margaret's handwriting was neat and deliberate, almost elegant. Then, several years later, the tone changed. She began writing about families struggling after factory closures, children arriving at school hungry, teachers quietly buying winter coats with their own money. Rather than complain, Margaret started organizing anonymous scholarships. She called it simply the Community Promise. Small donations, local fundraisers, book sales, bake sales, church collections. Nothing large, nothing glamorous. Just neighbors quietly helping neighbors. Elijah kept reading. Page after page listed children whose tuition, school supplies, or medical bills had been covered without anyone ever learning who paid. He found himself wondering what kind of person spent decades helping strangers without leaving her own name behind. The answer slowly appeared between Margaret's carefully chosen words. Because dignity mattered, people accepted kindness more easily when it arrived without applause. Hours passed without Elijah noticing. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the broken basement windows. Then another section of the journal caught his attention. The handwriting grew tighter. The sentences became shorter. Certain pages were marked with tiny blue stars. Margaret described irregular financial reports involving county education grants, invoices that did not match payments, scholarship money disappearing before reaching students, construction contracts signed for buildings that were never repaired. She never accused anyone directly. Instead, she gathered documents, dates, receipts, copies of letters, bank references. Again and again she wrote the same sentence. Not enough yet. She believed someone inside the county government had been stealing education funds for years. But every time she came close to proving it, another document disappeared. Another witness retired. Another trail ended. She refused to stop searching, yet she knew she still lacked one final piece of evidence. Only then could anyone believe her. Elijah leaned back in the chair. "So that's why this room was hidden," he whispered. His eyes wandered toward a gray, fireproof safe bolted beneath the desk. He pulled. Nothing. The safe required a key. No combination dial. No backup latch. Just one small keyhole. Whatever Margaret considered most important was still locked inside. As Elijah returned to the journal, two familiar names suddenly appeared again and again. Asterisk David Brooks. Asterisk Angela Brooks. He frowned. Brooks, his last name. At first he assumed it had to be coincidence. Then he turned another page. Margaret wrote, "David finished the reading room renovation today. Angela spent the afternoon reading to 23 children. Watching them together always reminds me that service can build stronger foundations than money ever could." Elijah's heartbeat quickened. Another page. "David insists on reinforcing the west basement wall himself. Says one day this room may protect something that matters." He swallowed hard. Another. "Angela says every child deserves one safe place. I believe she's right." The names appeared dozens of times. Not as employees, not as contractors, as friends, as people Margaret deeply trusted. Elijah closed the journal slowly. His hands had begun to shake. He had spent 19 years believing his parents were little more than names printed on a birth certificate. Now they suddenly felt real. Real enough to laugh. Real enough to dream. Real enough for someone to miss them. But who exactly had they been? And why had Margaret written about them as though they had changed the entire town? The answer, Elijah realized, was probably still somewhere outside this room. Someone had to remember. Someone had to still be alive. Nearly 3 weeks passed after Elijah discovered Margaret Ellis's hidden office. But instead of bringing him peace, the discovery quietly changed the way he looked at every corner of Westwood Community Library. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt patient. Every shelf he repaired, every broken window he covered with plywood, every dusty hallway he swept seemed connected to people whose names had slowly become real. David Brooks, Angela Brooks, Margaret Ellis. They were no longer strangers trapped inside faded journal pages. Somehow, they had become part of the silence that filled the old library each evening after the sun disappeared behind the oak trees. Elijah found himself working harder than ever. He rebuilt sections of damaged shelving using scrap lumber Calvin had given him. He organized hundreds of surviving books by hand. Some evenings, neighborhood children stopped outside the broken front doors and watched him work from the sidewalk. A few eventually wandered inside. "Is the library opening again?" one little girl asked. Elijah smiled. "I hope so." He realized it was the first time in years he had answered a question with hope instead of uncertainty. Word spread much faster than he expected. The local newspaper printed a short article with a photograph of Elijah standing beneath the weathered library sign holding a paint roller. Asterisk, "Homeless young man, Rester's forgotten library." Within days, strangers began stopping by. Some brought old books. Others donated paint or cleaning supplies. An elderly couple left 2 folding chairs outside the front entrance with a handwritten note. "Every library deserves readers." Elijah kept the note folded carefully inside Margaret's journal. One Monday morning, as he climbed onto a ladder repairing part of the reading room ceiling, a black luxury SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot. It looked strangely out of place beside the cracked sidewalks and faded brick. A tall man stepped out. He appeared to be in his late 40s, standing nearly 6'3" with broad shoulders, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where people immediately listened. His charcoal gray suit fit perfectly. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard outlined a square jaw, while sharp blue eyes scanned the building with the detached calculation of a businessman evaluating numbers instead of memories. He extended a hand. "Richard Coleman." Elijah climbed down from the ladder. "Elijah Brooks." Richard smiled politely. "I represent Coleman Urban Development in Atlanta." Elijah nodded without recognizing the company. Richard looked around the library. "You've done impressive work. Thank you. I'd like to make you an offer." They sat across from each other at one of the few tables Elijah had restored. Richard opened a leather portfolio. "My company plans to invest heavily in this district." He spread several architectural renderings across the table. Modern apartment buildings, retail shops, restaurants, wide sidewalks. Everything looked bright, clean, and expensive. "This library sits directly in the center of the proposed development." Elijah remained silent. Richard continued. We're prepared to purchase the property immediately. He slid a printed document across the table. The number at the bottom made Elijah blink. $400,000. More money than Elijah had imagined anyone would ever offer him. You paid $20, Richard said calmly. This changes your life. Elijah looked at the paper for a long moment. Only a month earlier, he would have signed without reading another word. A home, a reliable car, college tuition, food, security, everything he had never possessed. His mind quietly calculated all of it. Then another thought arrived. Margaret had hidden an entire room inside this building. His parents had spent years working here. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect whatever remained locked inside the safe. If the library meant nothing, why would anyone offer nearly $500,000 for land everyone else laughed at only weeks before? Elijah slowly pushed the contract back. I'm not selling. Richard's smile remained exactly the same. I understand emotional attachment. It isn't that. What is it? I think this building still has something important inside. For the first time, Richard's eyes shifted, only slightly, only for a second. But Elijah noticed. Richard closed the portfolio. If you change your mind, I won't. The businessman stood. I admire loyalty, Mr. Brooks. He paused near the front doors before speaking again. Just remember. He glanced around the empty reading room. Old buildings can become expensive responsibilities. Then he walked back to the SUV and drove away. Elijah watched until the vehicle disappeared. Something about the conversation refused to settle comfortably inside him. Richard had spoken politely, too politely. That evening, Elijah returned to Margaret's hidden office. He reread every journal entry mentioning construction, every page describing the basement, every note referring to David Brooks. Nothing explained the safe. Nothing mentioned the missing key. As darkness settled outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Elijah finally locked the office and climbed upstairs. The reading room felt strangely colder. A floor lamp he had repaired earlier that afternoon lay broken across the wooden floor. He frowned. He was certain he had unplugged it beside the front desk. Now it rested nearly 20 feet away. Books he had stacked neatly against one wall were scattered again. A rear window stood slightly open. Elijah walked toward it carefully. The muddy footprints beneath the window did not belong to him. Someone had been inside the library, and they had come after Richard Coleman left. By the next morning, Elijah understood that the library was no longer just an old building he was trying to save. It had become a battlefield, and the people fighting him did not intend to fight fair. He spent the early hours cleaning up the mess left by whoever had broken in. Books were scattered, drawers had been pulled open, and several folders from Margaret Ellis's hidden office had been moved. Nothing obvious was missing, but that worried Elijah more than if something had been stolen. Whoever came inside had been searching for something specific. Maybe the safe, maybe the key, maybe proof that Margaret had not died with her secrets buried. Calvin Reed arrived just after sunrise with a toolbox in one hand and a paper bag in the other. The older man's face tightened when he saw the muddy footprints near the rear window. Somebody's getting nervous, Calvin said. Elijah looked toward the hidden office. Because they know there's something here. Calvin handed him the bag. Egg sandwich. Eat before you start thinking too hard. Elijah wanted to smile, but he could not. He had barely slept. All night, one question kept pressing against him. If Margaret knew the safe mattered, why had she never opened it? The answer had to be somewhere in her records. He searched the office again, slower this time. In the bottom drawer of Margaret's desk, beneath old library cards and faded newspaper clippings, he found an address written on the back of a photograph. Sarah Ellis, 1427 Juniper Street. The photograph showed Margaret standing beside a younger woman on the front steps of the library. The woman appeared to be in her early 40s at the time, tall and slender with light brown skin, soft gray eyes, and dark curly hair pulled into a neat bun. Her posture was straight, almost guarded, but her hand rested gently on Margaret's shoulder. She looked like someone who had learned to be careful with grief, carrying it quietly instead of letting it spill. By noon, Elijah was standing outside a small white house on Juniper Street. The woman who opened the door appeared to be around 50 years old. Sarah Ellis had a slender frame, fair skin, gentle gray-blue eyes, and shoulder-length light brown hair touched with natural silver, neatly tied into a low bun. Time had softened her features, but not her quiet strength. She wore a pale blue cardigan over a light gray blouse and a navy skirt, and her calm voice carried the same kindness Elijah had imagined in Margaret's journals. She looked at Elijah for only a second before her hand tightened around the doorframe. "You're David's boy," she whispered. Elijah forgot the words he had prepared. "My name is Elijah Brooks." Sarah nodded slowly, tears rising before she could stop them. My mother said you might come one day. She invited him inside. Her living room was neat, quiet, and filled with books. A gray tabby cat, old and round with cloudy green eyes, slept on the arm of a chair without caring that a stranger had entered. Sarah noticed Elijah looking at it. That's Moses, she said. 17 years old and convinced he owns this house. The small joke eased the room just enough for Elijah to breathe. Sarah made tea, though Elijah barely touched his cup. He told her about buying the library, finding the hidden room, reading Margaret's journals, and discovering the locked safe beneath the desk. As he spoke, Sarah's expression changed from sadness to something heavier. My mother never had the key, Sarah said. Elijah looked up. She searched for it for years. She believed David had hidden it before the fire. Then why keep the safe? Because she knew what was inside mattered. Sarah stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf near the window. From behind a row of old hymnals, she removed a sealed manila envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in careful black ink, were the words, "For the son of David and Angela Brooks, if he ever comes home." Elijah stared at the envelope as though it might vanish if he moved too quickly. Sarah placed it in his hands. I found this after my mother passed, she said. She had hidden it inside one of her old books. I never opened it because it wasn't addressed to me. Elijah's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a small brass key taped to a folded letter. The handwriting was not Margaret's. Sarah's voice softened. That was your father's. Elijah unfolded the letter. David Brooks had written it 2 days before the school fire. He explained that he and Angela had helped Margaret collect evidence of stolen education grants, false construction invoices, and scholarship funds diverted through private companies. They were close to proving everything, but the people involved had power in the county. David feared that if Margaret exposed the evidence too early, she would be dismissed, discredited, or worse. So he locked the original proof inside the library safe. Only he kept the key. If anything happened to him and Angela, the letter said, Margaret was not to open the safe alone. The evidence had to be protected until their son was found, because Elijah was not only their child. He was the legal heir to David's private records, the one person who could connect the documents, the library renovation, and the Brooks family without the county burying the case as an old dispute. Elijah could barely finish reading. His father had not abandoned him. His father had prepared for him. Sarah reached across the table and placed a steady hand over his. Your mother used to bring you to the library in a yellow blanket, she said. Angela had a voice that made children sit still without being afraid. David was quieter, but when he spoke, people listened. They were good people, Elijah, very good people. That afternoon, Sarah returned to the library with him. Together, they entered Margaret's hidden office. Calvin stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, silent out of respect. Elijah knelt before the safe. The brass key slid into the lock perfectly. For a moment, he could not turn it. Not because it resisted, but because the weight of the moment seemed too large for one hand. Then he turned. The lock clicked. Inside were bank records, original contracts, handwritten notes, copied checks, and letters connecting county officials to a private development company that had received education money meant for schools and children. At the bottom was a folder marked in David Brooks's handwriting. Final proof. Do not separate. Elijah opened it and saw Richard Coleman's company name on documents dated years before Richard had ever stepped into the library. By evening, word had already reached the wrong people. A notice appeared on the library's front door, stamped by the county redevelopment office. Emergency public hearing, property review and demolition petition. 3 days. That was all Elijah had before they tried to take the library from him. 3 days passed faster than Elijah believed possible. Every hour seemed to disappear beneath stacks of documents spread across long library tables. Sarah carefully sorted Margaret's journals while Calvin organized the construction records David had hidden inside the safe. The old library, once silent and forgotten, had become a command center where every page carried the weight of someone's future. The morning of the county hearing arrived beneath a clear Alabama sky. The Jefferson County Administration Building was already crowded. Residents filled nearly every chair inside the public meeting room. Some came because they had heard rumors about corruption. Others came because they had watched a homeless young man slowly breathe life back into a building everyone else had abandoned. At the front of the room sat the county commissioners. Richard Coleman occupied a seat beside his attorneys. He wore another perfectly tailored charcoal suit, though the calm confidence Elijah had seen weeks earlier seemed thinner now. Richard still held his shoulders straight, but his fingers tapped quietly against the polished conference table whenever he thought nobody was watching. Elijah entered carrying 2 weathered archive boxes. Sarah walked beside him. Calvin followed several steps behind. One by one, more people entered the room: an elderly retired teacher, a former librarian, 3 adults who had once received anonymous scholarships as children, several retired firefighters who had known David and Angela Brooks. Richard looked around the room with growing concern. He had expected one frightened 19-year-old. Instead, an entire community had arrived. The hearing began with routine legal arguments. Richard's attorney claimed the abandoned library had become unsafe, financially impractical, and an obstacle to economic redevelopment. The proposed demolition, he concluded, will allow significant investment and create new opportunities for this county. Several commissioners nodded. Then Elijah stood. His voice shook during the first sentence, not because he was afraid, because he understood what this moment meant. "My name is Elijah Brooks." He placed Margaret's journals on the table. "My parents helped build Westwood Community Library." The room became quiet. "My father, David Brooks, designed the renovation that still stands today. My mother, Angela Brooks, spent years teaching children inside those walls." He paused. "They died believing that building belonged to this community." Elijah opened the first archive box. Inside were original contracts, construction invoices, canceled checks, donation records, scholarship ledgers. Every document remained exactly where David had placed it nearly 20 years earlier. Sarah quietly handed each commissioner copies prepared the previous evening. Then she stood herself. "My mother, Margaret Ellis, spent the last years of her life protecting these records." Her calm voice carried across the room. "She never released them because she never possessed the final evidence locked inside the safe." Sarah explained how David alone had kept the key, fearing the records would disappear if revealed too soon. Only after Elijah returned could the final collection be opened legally and completely. One commissioner slowly removed his reading glasses. "You mean these files have remained untouched for almost 20 years? Sarah nodded. "They were waiting for the person my mother believed would someday come home." The atmosphere inside the room shifted. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. A retired elementary school principal testified that scholarship money promised by the county repeatedly vanished before reaching students. A gray-haired woman named Evelyn Foster approached next. She was in her 70s, with silver curls neatly pinned behind her ears and warm brown eyes that still carried the patience of someone who had spent 40 years teaching first grade. She held back tears. "My grandson stayed in school because an anonymous scholarship paid his tuition." She looked toward Margaret's journals. "We never knew who gave the money." Another witness described canceled library repairs despite budgets showing every project fully funded. Calvin quietly placed several blueprints on the commissioner's table. David's original renovation plans matched invoices that had later been altered. Entire construction projects had been billed twice. Materials had been charged but never delivered. Then Elijah removed the final folder from David's safe. Across its cover were 4 handwritten words: *original financial authorization records. Every payment could now be traced. Every missing dollar followed. Every signature matched. The money intended for children's education had been redirected through shell companies connected to private developers over many years. Several of those companies eventually merged into businesses now controlled by Coleman Urban Development. Richard's attorney stopped taking notes. Richard himself slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time since entering the room, he looked uncertain. One commissioner asked quietly, "Mr. Coleman, would you like to respond?" Richard stood. He attempted to explain that many of the transactions happened before his leadership, that he had never personally approved illegal payments. But every explanation became weaker as additional records appeared. The room no longer belonged to lawyers. It belonged to facts. Within minutes, representatives from the Alabama Attorney General's office requested copies of every original document. A formal state investigation was announced before the hearing even ended. The demolition petition was immediately suspended. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Elijah. He answered only one question: "What happens to the library now?" Elijah looked toward Sarah before speaking. "It stays exactly where it belongs." Months passed. Construction crews repaired the roof. Local volunteers painted walls. Students helped organize thousands of donated books. The children's reading room reopened first. Then the computer lab. Then classrooms for after-school tutoring. Above the entrance, workers installed a new bronze sign, *Brooks Community Learning Center. Below it, in smaller letters, another plaque was added. Dedicated to David Brooks, Angela Brooks, Margaret Ellis, and every neighbor who believed education should never belong only to those who could afford it. On opening day, children filled every corner of the building. Some sat reading beneath windows Elijah himself had repaired. Others laughed around tables where broken furniture had once gathered dust. Sunlight poured through clean glass onto polished wooden floors. The building no longer felt forgotten, it felt alive. Near the front entrance, Elijah climbed a small ladder carrying 2 framed photographs. One showed David Brooks smiling beside unfinished library shelves. The other captured Angela reading to a circle of young children with a book open across her lap. He carefully hung them side by side. Then he stepped back. For a long moment he simply stood there, watching dozens of children turn pages beneath the same roof his parents had spent their lives protecting. He finally understood that they had never intended to leave him money. They had left him something far greater. A place where kindness could continue long after they were gone.